Chicago's west side was a frozen grey wasteland on the morning of December the 6th, 1908. The last snowfall turned into dirty slush. Ploughmen had piled it unevenly on the curbs and sidewalks as far as the eye could see. The streets were dangerous. The ice and mud on the cobblestones made them a treacherous mess. Horse-drawn wagons, streetcars, and the odd automobile skidded through the morning chill. Inside a cramped flat at 944 North California Avenue, a newborn's first cries cut through the stale air. This wasn't just any child. This was Lester Joseph Gillis, the boy who would one day be known as Babyface Nelson, a name that would strike fear across the nation. From the very start, there was something different about little Lester. Small but volatile, his temper flared early. There was no softness, no innocence, just an angelic face that concealed a much darker reality underneath. Lester was the youngest of Joseph and Mary Gillis's 6 children. They were Belgian-Flemish immigrants who had left Walloon-Brabant, a French-speaking area south of Brussels, for a better life in America. But what they found instead was hardship. The realities of city existence overwhelmed them and they struggled to adapt. The Gillis family settled in the dirty, industrial part of Chicago's west side in Humboldt Park. The air was heavy with the smell from the Union stockyards and neighbouring factories. Freight yards, water towers and viaducts filled the landscape. Nearby, the slow, polluted canals overflowed whenever it rained. It was a place where survival meant toughness, and young Lester had to learn the rules of the harsh environment. The neighbourhood was a melting pot of immigrant communities, each sticking to their own. To the south, Maxwell Street bustled with Jewish merchants, their market stalls overflowing with goods, and the sounds of haggling filled the air. Nearby, University of Chicago scholars brought a bohemian vibe. Further southward, the Irish and Polish communities formed their own tight-knit worlds. Lester's father, Joseph, worked long, tough hours at the stockyards. He toiled in the freezing ice houses on Canal Street. Nationality didn't matter much here. Everybody was simply another set of hands doing the hard work. It was a place filled with the stench of blood and sweat, and where back-breaking labour provided just enough to survive. Mary Gillis, a devoted wife, spent her days teaching her native French to local kids from wealthier families to help make ends meet. But while she taught discipline to her students, her son Lester was different. Left to his own devices, Lester roamed the mean streets of Chicago and eventually became as tough as the pavement that lay underneath his feet. Unlike his siblings, little Lester refused to accept the modest life. They followed their parents' expectations, but he wanted something different. He spent his childhood roaming Chicago's unforgiving streets, whilst his brothers and sisters went to school and church with the rest of the Gillis family. In a neighbourhood where brawling was as common as breathing, his short stature made him an easy target. He stopped growing at just 5 feet 4 inches, making him a natural victim for the older, stronger boys who ruled the area. His soft, angelic features didn't help much either. They invited punches, kicks, and the occasional baseball bat to the head. But Lester was no ordinary punching bag. One day, a switch flipped inside him. Maybe it was a beating too many, or maybe the constant humiliation brought up something uncontrollable. Whatever the reason, he stopped being a victim and transformed into a fighter. Small as he was, he learned to make up for his size with sheer ferocity. If he couldn't outmuscle his enemies, he'd outfight them. He studied boxing and honed his fighting skills in Chicago's backstreets. His fists were always bloodied, never bruised. His rage was a weapon, his strikes precise and punishing. He evolved into a one-man whirlwind of violence, a bantam rooster with a chip on his shoulder and a thirst for revenge. Lester Gillis became the kind of character that you wouldn't want to cross. He had a habit of lashing out without provocation, punching first and not really bothering with an explanation later. Maybe it was a classic case of short man syndrome, or maybe he just liked to hurt people. He roamed the streets of Humboldt Park with a pack of rough-edged kids who once tormented him, but now they followed his every move. For Lester, trouble wasn't something that found him, it was something he actively sought out. A broken shop window here, a pickpocketed drunk there, a ransacked store, a stolen car. Lester wasn't picky. For him, crime wasn't just an outlet, it was his way of life. As he grew older, his offences escalated, and the police at the 13th District Station knew his name well. Officers routinely patrolled the alleys near his home, hoping to catch the sandy-haired kid and his crew in the act. Sometimes they did, but Lester had a knack for slipping away just before they could grab him. By the time his parents realised what their son had become, it was already too late. They had unknowingly raised a street thug, and no amount of pleading, scolding or lecturing could change him now. The parish priest tried, the nuns at school tried, and his family tried. Nothing stuck. Their patience wore thin, and their gentle words turned to threats, then to desperate yelling, but it went in one ear and out the other. Eventually, his father resorted to old-fashioned discipline, using a leather strap to teach his son a lesson. It didn't work. The neighbourhood kids had beaten Lester up many times before he learned to fight back, so a few belts from a strap was not going to faze him. Around this time, Lester ran away. The escape, however, was short-lived. The police found him after a few days and dragged him home, where his parents, rather than punish him further, welcomed him with open arms. They decided they would prefer to have their troublemaking son under their roof than deal with the empty space that he left behind. By 1920, Lester, now aged 12, had fallen in with the Halstead Street Boys, a gang of tough kids who ruled their block with a mix of swagger and violence. They strutted through their turf like kings without crowns, daring anyone to challenge them. Lester fit right in. By the age of 13, he was already deep in the life, but his recklessness nearly cost him everything. In 1921, he got his first serious arrest after shooting a fellow Halstead street boy in the jaw with a pistol he had found during an argument. The courts didn't take it lightly. A judge sentenced Lester to over a year at the Illinois State Reformatory in Pontiac, a harsh military-style institution designed to break young offenders and set them straight. Located 100 miles southwest of Chicago, the Pontiac Reformatory was no playground. Discipline was strict, labour was tough, and rehabilitation meant long hours of work under the guards' watchful eyes. They had little patience for defiance. For the first time in his life, Lester had no control. No streets to roam, no gang to back him up, just cold grey walls and the weight of his own choices. But if Pontiac was supposed to reform him, it failed. By the time he walked out, Lester Gillis wasn't just another street kid, he was well on his way to becoming Babyface Nelson. FBI records from later years state that by age 14 in 1922, he was a skilled car thief, and his actions in March 1922 back this up. He was caught stealing a vehicle on Maxwell Street, and authorities convicted him of auto theft and placed him in a juvenile detention centre. They sent him to St. Charles School for Boys, a home where he spent nearly 2 years in confinement. This did nothing to improve his behaviour. Upon his release, he immediately returned to the streets, a knife in his pocket and a crowbar under his coat. If anything, his time away had only toughened him further. Just 5 months after his release in August 1924, police caught him red-handed. They caught him trying to break into a department store in the Loop, which is the main part of Chicago's downtown area. And actually, when they caught him halfway through the window of the department store with his legs hanging out onto the street. It truly was something like a Buster Keaton movie. When the police pulled on his legs, he did fight hard, thrashing against the officers and refused to go quietly. But outnumbered and overpowered, eventually Lester was dragged away in cuffs. And this time in court, the judge had no leniency towards Lester's actions, no second chances. He was put back into the system, and this time he was sent to the notoriously grim St. Patrick's boarding school in Momence, Illinois. Inside those cold, institutional walls, his anger only festered, but something else changed too. While Lester was locked away, his father, Joseph Gillis, committed suicide. Lester blamed himself, his criminal ways, his arrests, his disgrace. All of it, in his mind, had driven his father to suicide. The weight of guilt and grief made his imprisonment even darker, even lonelier. By the time he walked free, aged 18, in late 1926, the world outside had changed. And for a hardened street kid, now with a widowed mother he vowed to support, it had changed for the better. The 1920s brought a new level of crime that was much more profitable than petty theft. The 18th Amendment banned alcohol, but it didn't stop demand. Instead, Prohibition opened up fresh opportunities. Americans weren't going to quit drinking just because the government said so. Organised crime happily supplied liquor to the thirsty crowds. The underworld adapted quickly, stepping in to fill the void that the legal alcohol industry had left behind. Bootleggers smuggled liquor in from Canada and other countries. At the same time, local gangs opened breweries and their own speakeasies, hidden bars that defied the law. Anyone willing to get their hands dirty could make serious money. In Chicago, no one exploited this opportunity better than Al Capone. Capone, a former bouncer from Brooklyn in New York City, took control of Chicago's crime scene by the early 1920s. With police chiefs in his pocket and politicians too scared to stand up to him, he turned bootlegging into an empire. The cash poured in, and soon his operation extended beyond alcohol. Labour racketeering became another profitable venture. Capone's men infiltrated major unions, taking a cut of dues and using intimidation to ensure compliance. Not everyone played along willingly. Some resisted, and when they did, violence was the answer. Capone's main enforcer, Machine Gun Jack McGurn, was in charge of making sure that the unions fell in line. He needed muscle, guys who wouldn't hesitate to rough up or even kill those who stood in the way. Word spread quickly that McGurn was hiring, and Lester, always on the lookout for an opportunity to prove himself, answered the call. To Capone's outfit, Lester seemed like a natural fit. He'd been running his own mini protection racket with a couple of old friends from the Halstead Street Boys, where the business model was clear. They'd scare business owners into buying insurance and then punish anyone who didn't comply. Pawn shops, illegal bookies, brothels, the kind of businesses that couldn't go to the police, they were Lester's primary targets for his protection racket. And his plan of action was quite simple. He'd approach the owners of these businesses and say, "I think you need protection." And then naturally, the owners would fight back and say, "Well, no, we don't get any trouble here." And then soon, the trouble would start. Their stores or places would become ransacked, their employees would be beaten or sometimes even worse, and then Lester would go back a couple of weeks later and say, "Look, I think you need protection." The business owners, who were just unbelievably intimidated, would eventually comply and say okay and offer up X amount of dollars a week for Lester's protection, when it was the gang who was behind the trouble all along. And then usually Lester would seal the deal with a bit of a welcoming gift, which was a busted lip. just to remind the owner who was in charge. Now working for Capone, he traded small-time shakedowns to high-stakes union intimidation, and he excelled at it. He had a knack for shaking down labour unions, making sure that a slice of their dues found its way into gangster pockets. Lester didn't just enforce Capone's will, he revelled in it. Knives, revolvers, machine guns, even baseball bats, every tool had its place in his work. But while Capone's operation thrived on intimidation, he hadn't built it on mindless violence. Rules existed, and even the gangsters respected certain boundaries. That became a problem. Lester had a habit of taking things too far, and it was making the wrong people nervous. Al Capone relied on unions to support his political allies, and too many of their leaders were turning up battered, or even worse, dead. Lester's chaos caused complaints, even from the Unione Siciliana. This group, which predated the modern mafia as we know it today, complained to Capone about Lester's violence. Machine Gun Jack tried to rein him in, but it was useless. In the end, they had to cut him loose. Lester was furious, but he wasn't stupid. He knew better than to go about bad-mouthing Capone. What he didn't know at this moment is that McGurn had just saved his life. Given all the aggro that Lester had caused Al Capone, Capone had actually marked him for death. But Machine Gun Jack had taken a liking to Lester, being a fellow psychopath, and he actually talked Capone into letting Lester go, for now. Lester now had no steady income and a bad reputation. This made him unemployable, even to the city's crime bosses. So he had no other option but to put his criminal career on hold. In 1928, desperate for work, Lester took a job at a Standard Oil station at the top of North California Avenue, where he still lived with his mother, which remarkably is still a gas station today. The job itself was mundane, predictable, and far from the thrill that he craved, but it paid just enough to get by. During this time, he met 18-year-old Chicago saleswoman Helen Vovziniak. Lester was smitten, and Helen, despite knowing better, felt drawn to the fire in his eyes and the wild, dangerous energy surrounding him. Her family pleaded with her to stay away, but it was useless. Within a year, they were married. Not long after the wedding, Helen discovered that she was pregnant. A son, Ronald, was born in 1929, and shortly after, Helen gave birth to a daughter that they named Darlene. For Lester, reality hit hard. The meagre wages from the gas station wouldn't cut it. He had a wife and 2 kids to support now, and there was only one way he knew how to make real money. He went back to crime. As the 1920s came to a close, Lester put the word out. He was ready for work. Among Chicago's criminal factions, however, few were willing to take a chance on him. His reckless temper and violent reputation made him a liability, even with gangsters. But one man agreed to meet him, Roger Toohey, a powerful rival of Al Capone.
Captive, during the 12 days, did you see the face of any other person that you now see in the courtroom?
I did.
Will you point that person out?
Roger Toohey.
Roger Toohey, head of the kidnap gang.
Toohey had no interest in bringing Lester into his bootlegging empire. That was a business built on trust, deals and diplomacy, and Lester was no diplomat. Instead, Toohey introduced him to the members of his gang who specialised in armed robbery. Lester was all in. He ditched the petty tactics of his youth. No more creeping through windows or lurking in alleys. Now it was simple. Walk in, gun drawn, demand the cash, walk out. By 1930, as the Great Depression tightened its grip on the country, Lester Gillis was no longer just a small-time hood. With Roger Toohey's criminal connections providing the robbery arm of his crew, with wealthy homes to ransack, Lester and his gang were rising fast. It all started on January the 6th, 1930, when Nelson and his associates forced their way into the lakeshore home of magazine executive Charles Richter. The robbers tied him up, taped his mouth shut, cut the phone lines, and looted the house. They made off with jewellery valued at $205,000 then, or about $3.9 million today, an unbelievable score. The job was a success, so they ran the play again. 2 months later, they hit the Sheridan Road bungalow of Lottie Van Bulow, a wealthy widow escaping with $50,000 in jewels. So, with each new score, their reputation grew, and soon the Chicago newspapers were dubbing the gang the Tape Bandits, named after their signature move of taping up their victims before they looted their homes. By autumn 1930, Nelson was ready to take things up a notch. On October the 3rd, he and his crew hit their first proper job, the Itasca State Bank. They made off with $4,600, which is about $80,000 today, but the job wasn't as smooth sailing as the gang thought. During the heist, a bank teller got a clear look at Lester's face, and now law enforcement had a description of the leader of the Tape Bandits to go after. 3 nights later, he proved he wasn't just a thief, he was fearless. Nelson targeted one of the most powerful figures in Chicago, stealing $18,000 in jewellery from the wife of corrupt Mayor Big Bill Thompson. When later asked to describe her attacker, she recalled he had a baby face, he was good looking, hardly more than a boy, had dark hair and was wearing a grey topcoat and a brown felt hat turned down to the brim. This was the first time that Lester was publicly called Babyface, but with the press not knowing it was Lester behind the robberies yet, it wasn't at this point that the name stuck. By the winter, the robberies had taken a deadly turn. On November the 26th, Lester and his gang targeted a tavern on Waukegan Road, but this job was different. That night, Lester killed a man. During the heist, he fatally shot stockbroker Edwin R. Thompson, which was his first known murder. Over the next 4 weeks, he continued pulling jewellery store heists. Most of them were small scores, but in December 1930, he hit big. $5,000 worth of jewels from a store in Wheaton, Illinois. At home, Helen was thrilled. The morning after, Lester tossed an expensive ring into her palm and grinned. What depression. But the good times didn't last. Just weeks later, in January 1931, his luck finally ran out. Nelson walked into a Chicago jewellery store, gun in hand. This time, he didn't walk out. Police were close by and arrested him on the spot. Lester Gillis had gotten lucky with the law 3 times, and this time, they were not going to let him get off lightly. The judge sentenced him to 1 year to life for his failed Chicago heist, a vague but ominous stretch of time. His term started in February 1931 and he was sent to Joliet Penitentiary, a stronghold of concrete and steel just 20 miles southwest of Chicago. Unfortunately for Lester, things soon took a turn for the worse. Word reached him inside those cold walls of Joliet Penitentiary that a witness had identified him as the sole gunman in the Wheaton jewellery store heist. A separate trial was on the horizon and, if convicted, his legal team estimated that he could be staring down a 25 to 30 year sentence. At just 23 years old, his future looked seriously bleak, but as Lester's world shrank, Helen never wavered. She visited him regularly, standing by him despite the looming disaster, and during one of her many prison visits, the pair devised a plan that would set Lester free. On the morning of February the 17th, 1932, Lester, shackled to a plainclothes detective, boarded a commuter train bound for Wheaton. He was due at a long-postponed pre-trial hearing for the Wheaton jewellery store heist. Lester was found guilty and another year to life sentence was added to the time that he was already doing. On the way back to Joliet, he made his move. Faking sickness as the train began slowing at Joliet station, he groaned and slumped slightly in his seat. "I think I'm gonna be sick," he muttered, his face contorted in discomfort. The detective studied him warily but sighed. No one wanted to deal with a vomiting prisoner on a packed train. With a stern warning to Lester, "Try anything and you're done," the guard unlocked his handcuffs and gestured towards the bathroom. Lester turned and smirked at the guard and said, "You can come with me if you want, but I'd like a little privacy to vomit." The officer, already irritated, snapped, "Get moving," and cut the wisecracking. But the officer never finished that sentence. In a split second, Lester struck like a viper, landing a clean right hook across the guard's jaw, which sent him sprawling onto the laps of a startled couple on the next row of seats. Before the officer could recover, Lester was already bolting towards the exit doors of the train. In seconds, he had jumped off the train onto the station and was bolting towards the station exit, running down the embankment. Waiting for him at the curb was a getaway car. He jumped onto the hood, then clung to the running board as the driver, his wife Helen, gunned the engine. Tires screeched, the car lurched forward, vanishing before the stunned detective had time to react. For months, Lester stayed ahead of the law, leaving behind only a trail of stolen cars and vague sightings. His movements were erratic. He started in Chicago, then moved across the country. Eventually, he led authorities to Reno, Nevada. There, he briefly took up bartending jobs under the assumed name of Jimmy Johnson. A landlord and a co-worker later remembered him as a small man with sharp eyes and a quick temper. He was always with a petite woman who had a high-pitched voice. She clung to him. He called her his $1,000,000 baby, and they lived like nomads, never settling for long. In Reno, Lester fell in with crime bosses James McKay and William Graham, who controlled the city's underworld. The two had recently been indicted for mail fraud committed at the Riverside Bank, and the key witness against them was one of the bank's tellers, a man named Roy Frisch. When McKay and Graham learned of Lester's true identity and the ruthless killer that the underworld now knew he was, they saw an opportunity. They offered Lester $2,000 to take care of their problem. On the night of March the 22nd, as Frisch walked the 4 blocks home from the Majestic Theatre to his house at 247 Court Street, Lester jumped out of an alleyway and ambushed Roy Frisch, shooting him 3 times in the head, and Frisch died instantly. Lester drove the body 150 miles out of Reno to an abandoned mineshaft, but never disclosed the location, and Frisch's body was never found. Frisch came from an affluent family, and his sudden disappearance, especially given his role as the key witness against 2 of Reno's most powerful gangsters, made front-page news. Witnesses later recalled seeing a small man driving a large car, circling the area where Roy Frisch lived, asking if Frisch was around. Knowing it was only a matter of time before someone recognised him as the driver of that large car in the bar where he worked, Lester and Helen skipped town, leaving Reno behind. By the time law enforcement got close to them in Nevada, they had already vanished. This time they disappeared into California, a haven for fugitives who knew the right people. For years, Midwestern outlaws on the run found a safe haven in California. There, Sicilian crime boss Giuseppe Joe Parente offered protection from the law, but at a price. Sanctuary wasn't free. Every fugitive had to earn their keep. Some became bodyguards, others bootleggers, safecrackers, or getaway drivers. If you had a skill, Parente made sure that it was put to use. Lester and Helen slipped into this underworld with ease. They settled in Sausalito, a picturesque coastal town just across the bay from San Francisco, nestled in Marin County. During Prohibition, Sausalito became a bootlegging hotspot. Its location, facing the Golden Gate and cut off from San Francisco by the bay, made it the perfect staging ground for rum runners, daring folk who transported illegal alcohol across the water. Back then, the Golden Gate was not a bridge, it was a mile-wide strait. This strait was a dangerous stretch of water linking the Pacific Ocean to San Francisco Bay. During Prohibition, it acted as a gateway and a natural barrier. It protected smugglers from patrols and provided a direct path for illegal liquor shipments. Rum runners dodged strong currents and slipped by Coast Guard boats to keep San Francisco's speakeasies well stocked. In Sausalito, Lester and Helen settled in one of Parente's safe houses. California was unlike anything they had ever known. For two people raised in the smoke-choked streets of Chicago, the Golden State felt like a fantasy. The sky stretched wide and endless, a soft coconut white fading into the deep blue waters of the bay. Palm trees swayed in the breeze, Spanish-style bungalows dotted the hills, the February air felt warm, 80 degrees in the winter. Helen, who had spent her childhood sneaking off to the Tivoli Theatre on Chicago's South Side to watch the latest Hollywood films, was thrilled. The studios that made those very movies were now just a short drive away. The setting was perfect, a paradise where the law couldn't touch them. But paradise never lasts forever, and for Lester Gillis, the road ahead was paved with blood. His history in the Capone mob and his tough reputation gave Lester strong credentials that Joe Parente checked out before hiring him. The crime boss had Lester do many jobs, including working as a bartender in one of the speakeasies that Parente owned and as a personal bodyguard. At times, Parente even had him working as a parking valet at his high-end nightclubs, a position that Lester hated. But he was smart enough to keep his usual arrogance in check. He did what was asked, knowing that obedience might eventually pay off, and it did. Seeing Lester's ambition, Joe Parente moved him up in the mob and gave him a more important job in the bootlegging operation, moving illegal liquor to different buyers. Around this time, Lester decided it was the moment for a reinvention. He left behind his real name and took on the alias George Nelson. This name was inspired by Oscar Battling Nelson, a fellow Chicagoan and world lightweight champion. Both stood at 5'4", both were scrappy fighters, and Lester saw himself in the relentless boxer. From that moment on, he demanded that everyone, including his boss Parente, call him by his adopted name. For a while, the new identity worked. The Sausalito Police Department later noted that Nelson had fooled the locals in the early 1930s. Many people didn't know that the quiet bartender and parking attendant they met was actually a ruthless gunman and a key figure in the bootlegging scene. Bootlegging for Parente wasn't just about moving liquor, it was about control. His organisation supplied alcohol at steep markups for those desperate to drink, but the real money was in distribution. The aim was to grow, forcing speakeasies in Sausalito and nearby counties to buy only from Parente's operation. The competition was tough. Rival bootleggers didn't want to give up any of their turf. In Sausalito, Parente's main rivals were a handful of smaller Irish factions. Just as Capone made Chicago a battleground, a fierce gang war broke out in California's underworld. Nelson led the charge in that battle. He and his men would pull up outside a rival speakeasy, stride in, and demand to see the owner. No small talk, just business. The discussions were short, sharp, and absolute. One speakeasy owner later told the FBI about his encounter with Nelson, how the gangster shoved a gun down his throat and warned that if he bought booze from the Irish again instead of Parente, he wouldn't live to make the same mistake. When the rival Irish gangs pushed back, Nelson was always there, ready to retaliate. He didn't just follow orders, he absolutely relished the violence. Whether it was an ambush in the dark or a full-on shootout in broad daylight, he was always eager to engage. When his fists weren't enough, he often turned to pipe bombs and machine guns. No one in Sausalito or Marin County knew where this George Nelson had come, but they quickly learned that he was pure chaos in human form. By his side during these clashes was a loyal accomplice, John Paul Chase. Chase was fearless and well built, but not very bright. He was running errands for Parente when he met Lester, and the two soon became inseparable, with Chase hanging on his every word. Chase was born in California in 1901. He had a limited education and worked many jobs. Then he got involved in liquor smuggling. Their friendship grew so strong that Chase even introduced Lester to others as his half-brother. With the inseparable duo in charge, Parente took over bootlegging in Sausalito and later dominated all of Marin County. But this success wasn't enough. Bootlegging had made them rich, but it was Parente who got the biggest cut, and that didn't sit well with Nelson and Chase. They wanted more power, more money, more control. Making Joe Parente richer wasn't the plan. They were ready to take their own piece of the action. In their free time, they befriended two other criminals working for Parente. One was Tommy Carroll, a former boxer skilled with a machine gun, and the other was Eddie Green, a clever bank scout known as a jug marker, someone who scouted out banks for robberies. Both had plenty of experience in the Midwest. Lester felt enthralled. He sat mesmerised as they shared tales of daring heists, narrow escapes, and bags of cash. The amounts made his jewellery store stick-up seem laughable, but what truly captivated him was the mention of one name, John Dillinger. Dillinger was the outlaw king of his time. He was handsome, reckless, and charismatic. He robbed more banks than anyone else. More than Alvin Creepy Carpus, more than Pretty Boy Floyd, more than any of his peers. He was like a modern-day Jesse James, stealing across Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, and he did it with boldness and style. Lester was hooked. Parente's operation all of a sudden seemed insignificant. He wanted part of that action. He craved his name in the headlines. He wanted to be more than just a hired thug in California's underworld. His decision to break away was made even easier by Parente's growing habit of publicly teasing him. Despite Lester making it clear to absolutely everyone around him that he now wanted to go by the name of George Nelson, Parente found it funny to mock him by calling him Babyface. This was inspired from the popular song at the time, which was written by Harry Axt and Benny Davis. When he worked at one of Parente's clubs, the boss would call him over. He'd introduce him to his Sicilian friends as Babyface Nelson. Then, for his own entertainment, he'd belt out the lyrics to the song like an opera singer. Babyface, you've got the cutest little baby face. There is not another one to take your place. Lester had no choice but to grin and play along, because when Parente laughed, everybody laughed. But he had had enough. One day, Lester, Helen and Chase packed up their car and pointed it east. Their destination, the Midwest. Their goal, bank robbery. Lester could already picture the headlines, his name in bold, just like Dillinger's, but ironically, in chasing his dream, he would never escape the one thing he despised most. The nickname Babyface Nelson would follow him for the rest of his life. Lester Gillis understood that bank robbery was more than just a simple heist. It required skill and a reliable team. He needed experience, and he also needed a crew that he could rely on. With that in mind, he and John Paul Chase made their way to Long Beach, Indiana, which was a known gathering spot for criminals looking for work. Word on the street was that Homer Van Meter, one of John Dillinger's top men, was in town. Van Meter, a tough parolee from Michigan State Prison, earned a reputation as a quick-triggered outlaw with nerves of steel. He had already pulled off a couple of big bank heists under Dillinger's guidance, and he didn't hold back with his words. Nelson and Chase tracked him down to the bar at the Lafayette Hotel in Long Beach, hoping to secure a place in the gang that had been making headlines across the Midwest. But the moment that Van Meter laid eyes on Lester, it was clear he wasn't a fan. Van Meter didn't bother hiding his disdain. Nearly tipping off his bar stool in laughter, he mocked Lester outright, scoffing at the idea that he could join the Dillinger crew. He dismissed him as a punk, someone who had never robbed a bank in his life and wasn't worth their time. Lester seethed. The laughter stung, but picking a fight with one of Dillinger's top men wasn't a smart move. He tried to argue his worth, but Van Meter only doubled down, sneering as he recounted Lester's past, backstabbing bootleggers and strong-arming small-time operators. And then came the insult that always set him off: Babyface Nelson. Lester's expression darkened. He hated that name. Van Meter didn't let up, taunting him further. He called him reckless, unhinged, a liability that no gang wanted. The words hit their mark. Lester's temper flared, his fists clenched. He'd killed men for less, but this wasn't the time or place. With a final glare, he turned on his heels and stormed out. Humiliation burned in his chest, but he wasn't the type to stay down for long. They had written him off, but they wouldn't be laughing forever. Lester and Chase were still in town, trying to connect with the criminal underworld. Soon, they ran into their old friends from Sausalito, Tommy Carroll and Eddie Green. Like them, Carroll and Green were on the lookout for work. Low on cash and eager for action, the four men jumped into Lester's car. They armed themselves and hit the road. They weren't going to wait for an invitation. They were going to start robbing banks. On October the 23rd, 1933, Nelson and his crew raided the First National Bank in Brainard, Minnesota. They escaped with $32,000, about $700,000 today. But it wasn't just the money that made the headlines. As they fled, Nelson fired his submachine gun wildly at bystanders. He didn't care who got hit in the crossfire, and this shocked everybody who read about it. After the job, he met up with his wife Helen and their children. Then they headed south to San Antonio, Texas to lay low. In Texas, Nelson and his gang collected firepower by buying weapons from the underworld gunsmith Hyman Lehman. Among them was a .38 Super Colt pistol modified into a fully automatic weapon. Nelson and his crew continued their crime spree, and each job brought new lessons, with Lester studying Carroll and Green closely. He saw how they stormed into a bank, how they fired shots into the ceiling, making customers panic. They overpowered the guards before anyone could react. Then they forced employees to open the cash drawers and the vault. They timed everything perfectly. They bagged the money, sprayed the walls with gunfire to scare bystanders, and made a clean getaway. If a bank guard wanted to be a hero, or a teller was bagging the cash too slow, Lester had no problem ending them on the spot. It served as a message to the next bank that they robbed: cooperate or die. Chase, always loyal, usually waited outside in the driver's seat of the getaway car with his foot over the gas pedal, ready to speed off at any moment. Occasionally, Helen also rode shotgun. She gnawed on her fingernails, feeling thrilled by the danger. She once told Lester that he never looked more dashing than when he came running out from a bank holding a Thompson submachine gun, and he embraced that image completely. What Lester lacked in finesse, he made up for in sheer audacity. He was the first through the door, the loudest in the room, and the most aggressive. His voice rang through the banks, cursing, shouting, and barking orders. He demanded customers emptied their pockets. He wanted tellers to move fast. He told guards to drop their weapons unless they intended to die. It wasn't long before law enforcement and the press started identifying the gang as his. Chase, Carroll and Green didn't care so long as they got paid. But Lester was thrilled. His name was in the papers, but there was just one problem: that damned nickname. No matter how many times he introduced himself as George Nelson, no matter how many banks he robbed, the press always referred to him as Babyface Nelson. Despite his growing notoriety, Lester wasn't satisfied. His name was out there, but it wasn't big enough. After nearly every robbery, the credits seemed to go elsewhere. Sometimes it was misattributed to Pretty Boy Floyd, other times to the Dillinger gang. He respected Dillinger's skill, but he hated the attention the man got, the headlines, the legend, the massive bounty on his head. Babyface wanted that kind of fame for himself. Frustrated but determined, Lester set up a base in St. Paul, Minnesota, a known safe haven for outlaws. The city's police were notoriously corrupt, and criminals on the run could count on the local authorities to turn a blind eye. As long as they didn't cause trouble, fugitives could rest easy in St. Paul's upscale hotels, rubbing shoulders with the city's social elite. While Chase took some time off to visit family, Lester and Helen moved into the luxurious St. Francis Hotel, enjoying the glamour that came with being flush with stolen cash. By day, they frequented the Green Lantern Tavern, a bar known for its underworld clientele. By night, they were regulars at the Granada nightclub, a speakeasy under the St. Francis Hotel, catering to the wealthy and famous. At the Granada, they mingled with both criminals and Hollywood stars. Clark Gable, Jack Benny, Charlie Chaplin, and even Harry Houdini were known to frequent the place. It was in this very setting, at the Hotel St. Francis, that Homer Van Meter reappeared, only this time he wasn't laughing. The man who had humiliated Lester in Long Beach was now extending an offer. By February 1934, Dillinger's once mighty gang was in absolute shambles. Several key members, including Harry Pierpont, Charles Mackley, and Russell Clark, had been captured. Dillinger himself was sitting in Crown Point Jail in Indiana, which was supposedly inescapable. That left only Van Meter and John Hamilton still at large. They needed reinforcements, and Van Meter, begrudgingly, had to admit that Nelson was making a name for himself. Crime historian J. Robert Nash recounted the exchange as blunt and to the point. Van Meter made it clear Dillinger was looking to break out of prison soon, and Hamilton and Van Meter, who was still on the outside, were looking for action to help fund the jailbreak. Lester saw his opening. This was his chance to be on equal footing, but he wasn't just about to hand over jobs without setting his terms. The way he saw it, if Dillinger wanted in, he had to take orders. Van Meter bristled, barely restraining his temper, but Lester didn't give him chance to argue. He laid it down simply. Eddie Green had already scouted 2 banks that were high-paying targets, one in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and another in Mason City, Iowa. This was his crew, his jobs. They could take it or leave it. After a tense pause, Van Meter clenched his jaw and gave a curt nod. Van Meter was in. Next on the agenda was how they were going to break Dillinger out of jail. True to form, Babyface Nelson suggested a bold idea, blowing Dillinger out of the Crown Point jail with dynamite. But Dillinger was not on board. Communicating with the gang through his lawyer, Louis Piquet, he shut the idea down. The jail was crawling with armed guards, and police were already bracing themselves for a potential escape attempt. Too risky, too many guns, too many chances for someone to get killed. Instead, Dillinger suggested a quieter method of breaking out. On March the 3rd, 1934, John Dillinger pulled off his infamous wooden pistol escape from the Crown Point jail in Indiana. In the prison workshop, Dillinger made a wooden gun. He shaped it carefully and added details to make it look real. He used 2 nails for sights and a safety razor for the barrel. To complete the illusion, he darkened it with shoe polish. Once ready, he sprang into action. Taking 2 guards hostage, he rounded up every officer in sight, forced them into his own cell, and locked the door behind them. In a bold move, he walked out of Crown Point jail, got into the sheriff's car, and drove straight through the front gates, leaving the press and police looking like fools. Dillinger laughed all the way to St. Paul, where he would soon meet his newest ally. Lester had finally made it. The Dillinger gang wasn't his competition anymore. Now he was part of it. It didn't take long for John Dillinger to realise that teaming up with babyface Nelson was a mistake. Within the first 24 hours, he saw exactly what kind of man he had invited into his operation. Their initial formal meeting took place in Lester's hotel room at the St. Francis, with members from both gangs in attendance. Dillinger, tall, broad-shouldered and mustachioed, had a natural air of confidence. In contrast, Lester was small and wiry. He seemed eager to prove himself, but his bravado hid a deep insecurity. He skipped the small talk and jumped right into sharing his philosophy. "Before we go any further," he said, "I want you all to know that I don't take no orders. I walk into a bank, open fire, kill anything that moves. I grab the money and I'm out of there. If you don't like it, find yourself another patsy." The room went silent. Homer Van Meter, still stung by his pride after bringing Nelson in, saw red. The insults flew, tempers flared, and within seconds, both men had reached for their guns. They might have killed each other right there and then, if it not for Dillinger stepping in. He didn't like unnecessary violence, and he wasn't keen on babysitting hot-headed egos. Directing a sharp look at both men, he calmly ended the confrontation. "I've always found one thing works particularly well," Dillinger told them. "Cooler heads will always prevail." His meaning was clear: settle down or get out of the Dillinger gang. The very next morning, Dillinger witnessed firsthand the kind of chaos that Lester could bring. The two were driving through Minneapolis on their way to pick up John Red Hamilton, Dillinger's right-hand man. Lester was behind the wheel, running his mouth as usual, barely paying any attention to the road. He ran a stop sign and scraped a bumper of an oncoming car at the corner of Excelsior and Brookside Avenue. The other driver, Ted Kidder, unharmed but furious, stepped out and started shouting at him. Before Dillinger could even attempt to calm him, Lester stepped out of the car, pulled out his gun, and shot Ted Kidder dead between the eyes in front of his wife. Dillinger recoiled and shouted, "You didn't have to do that." As Lester was getting back into the car, he turned to Dillinger and said, "Hell, why not?" as if he had just swatted a fly, when really he'd shot an innocent man dead in the middle of Minneapolis. Dillinger knew right then that Nelson was going to be a problem. Lester's recklessness failed to improve with time. On March the 6th, 1934, Dillinger, Nelson, Van Meter, Hamilton, Green and Carroll arrived in a stolen white Packard at the Security National Bank and Trust Company in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Carroll stayed at the wheel as the rest of the gang rushed through the bank's Gothic doors. Thompson's submachine guns appeared from beneath coats. Customers and staff raised their hands, but before the gang could get control of the room, an alarm was triggered. Lester exploded. "Who did that? Which one of you sons of bitches did that?" he screamed, shoving the barrel of his gun into the faces of the terrified bystanders. "I'll find out who did it if I have to kill every damned one of you." Dillinger snapped at him and told him to forget about it. "You're supposed to be the lookout, so shut up and just keep an eye out for the screws." Lester shot Dillinger a murderous look, but turned his attention to the street. His anger faded into something much more dangerous: excitement. A police sedan had just pulled up outside. "You want screws, Dillinger? Well, here they are." Balancing himself on a desk, Nelson levelled his Thompson submachine gun at the plate glass window and fired. Officer Hale Keith was struck and fell onto the pavement, badly hurt. Lester cheered like a sportsman, landing a perfect shot. "I got one of them. I got one of the bastards. That'll teach them to interfere." Dillinger, however, wasn't celebrating. The gang grabbed their take, about $50,000, and made their escape, but the damage was done. Dillinger worked hard to avoid unnecessary violence. He knew that killing policemen would only bring more trouble. And here was babyface Nelson, acting like an unhinged lunatic, treating the whole thing as if it was a game. Dillinger wanted to cut him loose, but it wasn't that simple. Nelson had brought valuable bank jobs to the table, not to mention the firepower of Tommy Carroll and Eddie Green. Against his better judgment, John Dillinger decided to stick it out. 8 days later, on March the 13th, 1934, the gang struck again, this time in Mason City, Iowa. Dillinger, wary of Nelson's temper, convinced him to stay by the getaway car, but even with him outside, the job quickly turned complicated. First National Bank President Willis Bagley, spotting the gang entering, didn't hesitate. He spotted the shine of steel under their coats, then he ran and locked himself in his office with the vault keys. Van Meter, realising what had happened, sprinted after him, but he wasn't fast enough. The door slammed shut and Bagley refused to budge. Frustrated, Van Meter fired several rounds into the door, but it held. No amount of threats or gunfire could force Bagley out. In the bank's main hall, the gang soon saw that they weren't in a typical small-town place. The bank, one of the richest in the state, invested a lot in vault security. This was to fight the rise in bank robberies across the country. A steel cage was set up over the bank's lobby. It looked like a fortress and had enough room for a guard. It even had scanning holes and a gun port. It was an uncommon security feature, and today it was fully staffed. Guard Tom Walters launched a swift counterattack from inside the reinforced cage. He threw a tear gas shell into the bank's main lobby, which struck Eddie Green in his back. Green staggered back before steadying himself and retaliated with a burst of submachine gun fire in the direction of the steel cage. The bullets, however, did nothing. The steel barrier held firm. One round ricocheted, catching Walters with a minor wound, but it wasn't enough to stop him. The gas thickened, burning the eyes and throats of everyone inside. The gang did their best. They pulled handkerchiefs up over their faces and carried on scooping up cash. However, visibility was getting worse. Seconds later, Dillinger emerged from the bank's entrance, coughing violently, his face slick with sweat and tear gas. Lester eyed him warily. "What the hell happened to you?" But before Dillinger could respond, a shot cracked through the air and the bullet clipped him in the elbow. Dillinger twisted and kept his balance, then he ducked behind the Packard with Lester. The two men scanned the buildings across the street, searching for the shooter. Lester fired off a few rounds, but there was no sign of movement. Dillinger cursed the interfering publics and he shouted in the direction of the shooter, "This is a $100 tailor-made suit, you bastard." 3 stories up, retired officer John Shipley crouched by his office window, holding his shotgun. He had recognised the scene for what it was almost immediately. Dillinger dashed from behind the Packard to the bank's entrance, urging Nelson to keep his head down, fully aware that they were sitting ducks under Shipley's crosshairs. Lester kept crouched behind the Packard, his eyes darted to the street corners. He knew sirens would arrive soon. He could already picture them closing in, trapping them like rats. And then they arrived. A half dozen squad cars, lights flashing, tyres screeching. Lester tensed, bracing for a shootout, but before he could grab his Thompson, he saw something remarkable. Dillinger had pulled off one of his signature moves. More than 24 hostages surrounded him and the gang. Employees and customers were packed tightly together as the crew pushed them towards the getaway car. It was genius. The police couldn't risk opening fire without hitting civilians. Dillinger ordered Lester to the wheel, but in the chaos, they'd forgotten about the sniper. As Dillinger and Van Meter lined up hostages on the car's running board, Officer Shipley took aim again. The blast struck Dillinger in the same arm as before, and Van Meter threw him in the back seat of the car to prevent any further injury. At the same moment, Lester's hat was blown clean off his head. He spun around, his eyes narrowing as he spotted movement in an upstairs window. This time, he fired back, but Officer Shipley had already ducked out of sight. Furious, Lester took out his frustration on the nearest hostage. It was the bank's vice president, an elderly man who was struggling to keep up with the others. Lester grabbed the vice president in front of him as cover. The old man groaned in pain and cursed under his breath. Lester fumed. He pulled out his pistol and held it towards the man's chest, ready to deliver a final, fatal blow. Before he could complete his threat, Dillinger knocked the firearm out of his hand and it discharged harmlessly against the car door. Startled, Lester turned to see that Dillinger, who was propped up in the back seat, had knocked his weapon out of his hand. Dillinger quickly retrieved the weapon and said, "No need to kill him, Nelson. Now do your job, leave these people alone and get us the hell out of here." Lester's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He slid into the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The engine rumbled to life and the car eased forward, hostages still clinging to the sides. Police stood frozen, powerless to act. 5 miles out of town, they released the hostages unharmed. Lester, however, was seething. He pressed the gas pedal harder, his foot flattening against the floorboard. The car hurtled towards the horizon, the fury in Nelson's chest burning hotter than ever. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had had enough. The Midwest had become a playground for outlaws, its rolling cornfields transformed into the new Wild West. The only difference was that time had swapped the horse for a Ford and the 6-shooter for a Thompson submachine gun. The legendary gunslingers of the past, Jesse James, Billy the Kid, John Wesley Hardin, Butch Cassidy, they hadn't disappeared. They had evolved. Their names now sounded like a list of modern bandits: John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Bonnie and Clyde. At a widely publicised press conference, Hoover revealed the Bureau's first public enemies list. This list named the country's most wanted criminals. He made one thing clear: they would hunt these men relentlessly. They would either be captured or they would die. There would be no in-between. At the very top of the list, John Dillinger. Right below him, Lester Gillis, aka Babyface Nelson. Hoover wasted no time. Special Agent Sam Cowley was put in charge of the hunt for Dillinger. Setting up base in Chicago, he worked alongside Melvin Purvis, the head of the city's field office. Under their leadership, a team of agents spread out. They chased every lead and followed every whispered rumour. By late March 1934, they reached St. Paul, Minnesota. Dillinger, Nelson and the rest of the gang were hiding there after the Mason City bank job. On March the 30th, a tip sent federal agents to the Lincoln Court Apartments. They believed Dillinger was staying there with his girlfriend, Billy Frechette. The agents moved in. Gunfire erupted, bullets tore through the walls and windows, but when the smoke cleared, Dillinger was gone. He had escaped once again. But Hoover's list didn't just have Dillinger's name on it, and the other outlaws marked for elimination wouldn't be so lucky. News of Dillinger's near miss reached the rest of the gang in a matter of minutes. Knowing the heat was on, they split up. Lester and Helen disappeared into the wilderness of Iron County, Wisconsin. They rented a remote cabin in the woods and waited for news from their scattered associates. Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll and John Hamilton vanished into the west of Mississippi. Eddie Green, however, made a fatal mistake. Instead of hiding, the gang's expert jug marker stayed in St. Paul with his girlfriend, Bessie Skinner, and the FBI tracked him down. On April the 3rd, federal agents stormed Bessie's apartment on Rondo Avenue. Green tried to fight his way out, but unlike Dillinger, he wasn't fast enough. He was shot multiple times. Days later, he succumbed to his wounds in the hospital. Holed up in the Wisconsin woods, Lester fumed, not over Eddie Green's death, but over hearing that Dillinger was named public enemy number 1, and it made him furious. No matter how many banks he hit, no matter how many men he gunned down, he was still being overshadowed. And then came the final insult. The price on Dillinger's head was $20,000. The bounty on Lester's, only $5,000, and he took it personally. Lester himself ranted to those around him. Don't these lawmen know they are dealing with the most dangerous man in America? They should want to pay top dollar to get the most dangerous man in the country, don't you think? But when back in Dillinger's presence, Lester kept his bitterness to himself, for now. By mid-April, the gang regrouped with their wives and girlfriends at a hidden spot in northern Wisconsin and gathered to plan their next bank robberies. Their sanctuary was Little Bohemia Lodge. It was a rustic retreat nestled in the woods 50 miles north of Rhinelander. It was the perfect hideout. The lodge was mostly visited by hunters and fishermen. Since the sporting season didn't start until May, the area was nearly empty, or so they thought. For the gang, Little Bohemia Lodge seemed like the ideal hideaway. In the remote Wisconsin wilderness, it really was the last place that anyone would think of to try and find some of America's most wanted men. But to the lodge's owner, Emil Winatka, something didn't add up. Why would a group of smartly dressed men and women be so far off the beaten track at this time of the year? To him, something didn't add up. He decided to take no chances and called the local police, who in turn contacted the FBI. As soon as federal agents heard the descriptions, they knew they had a lead. The descriptions of 2 of the guests matched John Dillinger and Babyface Nelson. Melvin Purvis, the Bureau's top man in the Midwest, wasted no time. He put together a strike team of about 30 agents from different cities in the region. He told them to meet in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. Private planes flew in select operatives from St. Paul and Chicago, and on April the 22nd, 1934, they gathered for a final briefing led by Special Agent Sam Cowley. Then, as night fell, they set out for the lodge. The operation started badly. 2 Bureau cars broke down on the rough roads. This forced agents to ride on the running boards of other vehicles in the biting cold. With just 2 miles left, they turned off their headlights and moved in slowly. They rolled onto the lodge's property, listening to the soft sound of the engines idling. Then, as they approached the lodge, the main door opened. 3 men emerged, stepping off the porch and into a parked coupe. It was not Dillinger's men, but in the confusion, the FBI didn't know that. Purvis, still at a distance, called for them to stop. The men in the car didn't respond. Their cranking engine drowned out the warning, and the agents opened fire. The driver slumped over the wheel, killed by 7 bullets. The other 2 were badly wounded. When the agents rushed forward to inspect the bodies, horror set in. They had just gunned down 3 innocent tourists. Back inside, gunfire at midnight only meant one thing. It was time to run. Dillinger, Van Meter and Hamilton were in the middle of a poker game when the shots rang out. Without hesitation, they ditched their cards, grabbed their weapons and sprinted for the nearest exits. Dillinger and his crew vanished into the trees before the FBI even knew that they were gone. Elsewhere in the lodge, Tommy Carroll slipped through a window and disappeared into the darkness. But Lester was different. He had been holed up in a nearby cabin and reacted exactly as expected, head on and guns blazing. Spotting the FBI raiding party, he opened fire on Melvin Purvis, exchanging a volley of bullets before retreating into the main lodge under heavy return fire. But rather than sticking with the others, Nelson slipped out the back and bolted into the woods, taking off in the opposite direction. He spent nearly 90 minutes moving through the thick forest, and finally he emerged a mile from Little Bohemia and found the Lang family's home. Wasting no time, he forced them at gunpoint into their car and ordered them to drive. Before long, Nelson grew impatient with the car's sluggish pace. Spotting a brightly lit house ahead, he commanded them to pull over. Inside, switchboard operator Alvin Kerner had already caught wind of the FBI raid and immediately called the authorities, reporting the suspicious vehicle now idling outside his home. Nelson burst into the house and took Alvin Kerner hostage. At around the same time, the owner of Little Bohemia Lodge, Emil Winatka, showed up at the house. Winatka was forced behind the wheel of his own car at gunpoint, and just before they were about to set off, another car pulled up. Inside were FBI agents W. Carter Baum, J. Newman, and local constable Carl Christensen. The moment they stepped out, Nelson ambushed them. Newman, still behind the wheel, barely had time to react before Nelson opened fire. His custom .38 Super Colt pistol fired into the group, seriously injuring Christensen and Newman. Agent Carter Baum took 3 bullets to the neck and died instantly. Later, Nelson expressed confusion over why Baum never fired back. He told Chase, "Baum had me cold. Why didn't the punk fire?" When authorities found his weapon, the safety was still on. With the agents down, Nelson threw them out onto the road and stole the FBI car and sped off. But less than 15 miles away, his luck ran out. A flat tyre slowed him down, and as he tried to change it, the car became stuck in the mud. With no choice but to flee on foot, he disappeared into the forest once again. He spent several days in a hidden cabin, resting and regaining strength. Then he stole another car and escaped for good. Back at the lodge, the FBI took prisoners, but not the ones they wanted. 3 of the gang's women, including Helen Gillis, Nelson's wife, were captured inside. After intense FBI questioning, they were found guilty of harbouring, but were later released on parole. The botched raid was an absolute public relations disaster for the FBI. 1 agent was dead, as was an innocent bystander. 4 others, including 2 civilians, were severely wounded, and the whole Dillinger gang got away. Criticism poured in. Many called for J. Edgar Hoover's resignation, and a widely circulated petition demanded the suspension of Melvin Purvis. The Little Bohemia raid was supposed to bring down Dillinger, Nelson, and the rest of the gang. Instead, it only added to their legends. Lester Gillis was in California when he heard the news, the best news of his life. John Herbert Dillinger, the untouchable outlaw, the living legend, the man law enforcement just couldn't catch, was dead. On the humid Sunday evening of July the 22nd, 1934, Dillinger had walked straight into an FBI ambush outside the Biograph Theatre in Chicago. Betrayed by a woman and gunned down in the street as he tried to run, he had died just like any other fool who wasn't quick enough. Now he, Babyface Nelson, was at the top of the list and officially public enemy number 1. After the shootout at the Little Bohemia Lodge and his murder of Special Agent Carter Baum, Lester had vanished. He spent a month hiding out on an Indian reservation near Lake Flambeau, Wisconsin, moving only when necessary. By the time he finally re-emerged to Chicago, the heat had started to die down. Helen had been picked up by the police at Little Bohemia, but was paroled after just 3 weeks. As soon as she was free, she tracked him down, and so did John Paul Chase. Lester had plans, big ones, but the old gang was gone. Eddie Green, dead. Tommy Carroll, cut down in a hail of bullets in Waterloo, Iowa, after trying to evade arrest. With federal agents tightening their grip on the Midwest, Lester decided it was time to disappear for a while. He, Helen and Chase headed west to California, where they remained throughout the summer of 1934, waiting for the right moment to return. Even with Dillinger gone, Hoover's war on crime was far from over. Lester followed the headlines as one by one the old names were erased. John Red Hamilton, killed the day after the Battle of Little Bohemia by police at a roadblock. Homer Van Meter, gunned down in St. Paul. Bonnie and Clyde, ambushed and slaughtered outside Shreveport, Louisiana. Pretty Boy Floyd, killed in an Ohio cornfield. The outlaw era was crumbling, yet somehow Babyface Nelson was still standing. He kept slipping through the FBI's grasp, avoiding the fate that claimed so many who had once held his position of public enemy number one. Yet his survival came with a price, one that absolutely infuriated him. No matter where he turned, the ghost of John Dillinger haunted him. The press wouldn't stop comparing them, and always in ways that insulted Lester. They spoke about Dillinger's skill, his cunning, his ability to evade the law like a gentleman outlaw. But Lester was no gentleman outlaw. They portrayed Babyface Nelson as a punk, a rabid dog, a trigger-happy maniac, and Lester was furious. "I'll show them," he ranted to Chase. "I'll show him who's the better man. Even if I have to rob a bank a day, they'll see who's the best." Lester, Helen and Chase left Flambeau for Nevada, lingering in the town of Minden for a short spell before heading back to Chicago. Lester had one goal in mind: to build a new gang, but the underworld wanted nothing to do with him. He was too hot, too unstable, too reckless. No one would want to work with him, and whispers began circulating that he wouldn't live to see Christmas. Lester and Chase weren't as invisible as they thought. FBI Inspector Sam Cowley had learned of their return to Illinois. Cowley was one of Hoover's most brilliant and relentless agents, a man known for his analytical mind and unwavering dedication. With Melvin Purvis at his side, he was determined that this time Nelson wouldn't slip away. Through eyewitness reports and informants, the Bureau tracked his movements. Lester's Ford V8 was seen frequently along the highways between Chicago and Lake Geneva. From time to time, he and Chase stayed at various roadside resorts, but they never lingered too long. Cowley wasn't taking any chances. He ordered a full-scale manhunt. Agents swept the highways, staked out diners and gas stations, and questioned farmers and motel clerks. They studied every car that passed, every face in a crowd. It was only a matter of time. Lester Gillis had always promised to go down fighting. On November the 22nd, 1934, he made good on that promise. Around 8 AM in the morning, Lester, Helen and John Paul Chase drove south in a stolen Ford V8. They took US Highway 12, now known as US 14, heading towards Chicago. Nelson was always on the lookout for federal agents, and soon he saw a sedan. It was driven by agents Thomas McDade and William Ryan. After a series of U-turns, eventually both cars locked eyes, and now Nelson was pursuing them. When his Ford V8 caught up with the agent's slower sedan, John Paul Chase opened fire. The agents fired back, then, thinking they were outgunned and needed backup, they sped away and drove into a field. What they didn't know is that one of their bullets had pierced one of Nelson's water pumps, which was quickly draining power from his car. As Nelson's damaged Ford drove south, a second FBI vehicle arrived. It was a blue Hudson, driven by agents Herman Hollis and Samuel Cowley, and they joined the chase. Nelson knew that his car was dying, and if he didn't act fast, the chase would be over, but not in his favour. He saw a chance and turned sharply into Barrington's Northside Park, stopping by 3 gas stations. Hollis and Cowley sped past him by 100 feet. They slammed on the brakes, skidded to an angle, and then stepped out as gunfire rained down. Nelson shouted for Helen to take shelter in a nearby ditch. Then he and Chase returned fire. In the chaos, a bullet from Cowley's machine gun struck Nelson in the lower abdomen. Leaning on the Ford's running board, Nelson grabbed his .351 Winchester rifle from the back seat. Then he did the unthinkable. He charged straight at the agents. "What the hell are you doing, Les?" Chase shouted. "I'm sick of this cat and mouse. I'm gonna kill those bastards." Nelson advanced on the agents, firing so fast with his rifle that bystanders mistook it for a machine gun or that he had it modified, which he didn't. Cowley took 6 bullets to the chest and stomach. Hollis, shotgun in hand, blasted Nelson's legs, knocking him down. For a moment, the battle seemed over, but Lester wasn't done yet. As Nelson staggered back to his feet, Hollis, already wounded, took cover behind a utility pole and reached for his service pistol. In response, Nelson fired a fatal shot to Hollis's head, who collapsed. Nelson staggered over to Hollis and stood over his body for a brief moment before moving towards the agent's Hudson. His own car was dying, but theirs wasn't. Too wounded to drive, Nelson ordered Chase behind the wheel. They moved guns and supplies from the Ford to the Hudson, then they loaded Helen inside and fled. But Nelson had been hit 17 times. 7 bullets from Cowley's submachine gun had ripped through his torso. 10 shotgun pellets from Hollis had torn into his legs. Slumped in the back seat, his voice fading, he turned to Helen and whispered, "I'm done for." Nelson then muttered final directions to Chase, guiding him to this safe house at 1627 Walnut Street in Wilmette. Nelson was gravely wounded and was placed in a bed upstairs. Helen sat alone with her dying husband, watching as he seemed to gather one last flicker of strength. His voice, weak but steady, broke the silence. "Say goodbye to Mother," he murmured. He went on, naming each of his family members, his sisters, his brother, nieces, nephews, and in-laws. But when he spoke of their children, his voice cracked and tears welled in his eyes. For a time, he fell silent. Then, in a final whisper, he said, "It's getting dark, Helen. I can't see you anymore." At 7:35 p.m, with Helen by his side, Lester Joseph Gillis, aka Babyface Nelson, finally met his brutal end. He was just 26 years of age. Doctors declared Herman Hollis dead shortly after he arrived at the hospital, aged just 31. His partner Sam Cowley spoke briefly with Melvin Purvis and had surgery, but sadly he later died from an abdominal wound, just like Nelson's, aged 35. After a tip from a Chicago telephone company worker, Nelson's body was found. It was wrapped in an Indian pattern blanket. Helen put the blanket there, later explaining to detectives he always hated being cold. The body was found in a ditch at the northeast corner of St. Paul's Lutheran Cemetery in Skokie, Illinois. His body was then taken to Sadovsky's funeral home at 1845 North Hermitage Avenue, where it attracted this large crowd. The feds had spent years hunting Babyface Nelson, but in the end, he had saved them the trouble. In the aftermath, Helen and Chase fled. After J. Edgar Hoover's harsh orders to find the woman and give her no quarter, the FBI issued a death order for Nelson's widow. Helen roamed Chicago as a fugitive for days, then she surrendered on Thanksgiving. Chase made it to the West Coast, but his freedom didn't last long. 2 months later, he was arrested. He was sentenced to life in prison and remained behind bars until his parole in 1966. He died of cancer in his native California shortly after. Helen was sentenced to 1 year in a Michigan women's prison. She had violated her parole from Little Bohemia Lodge. Upon her release, she vanished into anonymity. Cowley and Hollis, killed in the line of duty, were mourned as heroes. Their deaths sealed the fact that no redemption existed for babyface Nelson. Any hope of his name carrying the mystique of John Dillinger, or perhaps the folk hero charm of Pretty Boy Floyd, or maybe the Robin Hood myth of Bonnie and Clyde, was completely gone. Dillinger had died walking into an FBI trap cut down in a Chicago street. Floyd had died outgunned in an Ohio cornfield, never even getting the chance to fire back. Their deaths had evoked sympathy from the public. Nelson's death didn't evoke any sympathy at all. He had gone out like a rabid animal, bleeding out in the back of a car after another reckless, senseless, and meaningless rampage. He had spent his lifetime trying to prove that he was the most dangerous criminal in America, and to be fair to Lester, I think in the end he did prove that. Thanks so much for watching, I really do appreciate it. Please do consider becoming a channel member if you do want to see more weekly content like this, and please do like the video and subscribe, and I shall see you in the next one.